Well-known South African citizen, model, actress and TV personality Shashi Naidoo has been blocked from visiting Palestine. Anti-Israel group BDS South Africa says Naidoo joins a growing list of South Africans who have been denied passage to Palestine. They include Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Minister Blade Nzimande, and the World Council of Churches leader Isabel Piri, among others. Naidoo had sought to undertake a visit to the territory to see for herself evidence of oppression and political suppression in Palestine. In June, Naidoo got death threats after she used derogatory language to describe Palestine while making pro-Israel sentiments. She immediately apologized and announced she would undertake an educational trip to Palestine. BDS South Africa has once again reiterated its position of South Africa-Israeli diplomacy, calling them a farce of diplomatic relations. All right, for more on this, we're joined in the studio by a spokesperson of BDS South Africa, Kwara Kekana. Kwara, as always, a pleasure to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Morning, Flo. Thank you so much for having us.
All right, so the news is out that Shashi Naidoo was asked not to enter Israel. We understand, of course, that she was denied because Israeli authorities are the ones who control access to Palestine, which, of course, in itself is also quite a concern. But talk to us about your reaction to her being denied entry. I mean, we've heard you saying that Israel's continued refusal is showing that they don't want a freedom of expression or freedom of movement or freedom of association. Talk to us really about this reaction from BDS.
So I think the one interesting thing, Flo, is that the order or the directive to deny Shashi into Palestine came from one of the top echelons in the Israeli government. The one is from the Minister of Interior Affairs, and the second is also from the Minister of Security Affairs in Israel. And these are some of the top ministries that have dedicated, their efforts into fighting and trying to combat the efforts of the global BDS movement. So that's the first part there. But so the other problem that they reiterated is that they believe that Shashi Naidoo is on a BDS organized trip, and that is why they are denying her entry into or passage into Palestine. Of course, I mean, it's a conversation we were having earlier as well. You know, as you'd remember, back in 2017, December, Israel released a blacklist. On the blacklist, there were over 20 organizations where Israel reiterated that these organizations, their members and their leaders will not be granted entry into occupied Palestine. This includes various BDS chapters across the world, BDS Colombia, of course, including BDS South Africa, and many other organizations such as the Jewish Voices for Peace in the United States. And again, one of their leaders was recently denied entry or passage into Palestine. So what Israel does is that if a trip is not sanctioned by them or their lobby group, they would never agree to it. So those that are critical of the Israeli occupation of Palestine, they have a problem with. And that's why you see an increasing number of people that denied passage into Palestine, people that you've mentioned already, like Desmond Tutu, the World Council of Churches leader, Isabel Piri as well, but also members of the EAPPI program. It's a program, the World Council of Churches to Palestine and Israel, coordinated by them. So a number of people really are on this list, and the list is increasing daily. And those are the people that are critical of the Israeli regime.
Now, was Israel not justified in assuming that this trip by Shashi was a BDS organized trip? I mean, you remember that your organization did have that press conference that they held with her, and you expressed the fact that you support her wanting to go on this fact-finding mission into Palestine. You supported her, well, you forgave the apology that she gave South Africans. So was Israel not, I suppose, justified in their way to say, well, this is a BDS-sponsored trip, and the fact that your organization is, in fact, blacklisted in Israel?
So I think two things are quite problematic in this entire situation. The fact is that Israel controls Palestinian borders. I think that's the biggest fundamental problem. But again, Israel prides itself, and it argues that it's the biggest democracy in the Middle East, and, it's open to engagement and so on. But this is a typical example of that Israel is not actually open to engagement, and they actually don't pride itself on democracy. So for as long as you speak critical of Israel, and I mean, to be critical of Israel, for example, you're calling out Israel exactly what it is. It's an apartheid state. And the fact that it believes that it can also muzzle organizations such as the global BDS movement and other progressive organizations internationally that are critical of the regime that practices settler colonialism, occupation, and apartheid is very problematic. So actually, they don't practice democracy. They're not open to engagements. They want to channel how people want to think, which is very problematic.
So just explain to me then, why is it then that it's the Israeli authorities that control access to Palestine? What is the reasoning or justification from Israeli that you've heard?
So I think the bottom line here, Flo, is that Israel is an apartheid state. And I mean, when you look international law, insofar as military occupations are concerned, and if you look at the Israeli occupation of Palestine, it's one of the longest military occupations in human history. Military occupations in their nature are meant to be temporary. But when you look at the Israeli occupation of Palestine, this seems to be one of the most, so it's the longest in human history, but it seems to be permanent, which is very problematic. And so nothing comes in by air, by land, or by the sea unless Israel permits it to, which is very problematic.
Now, you've said you see this as Israel's continued refusal of freedom of movement, expression, and association, as we've said. But why do you believe that this has been ongoing? I mean, you've said it's the longest in history without that much pressure from international community. I mean, we hear your voices. We hear, people like Desmond Tutu. We hear a lot of organizations raising their concerns about what's happening in Palestine. But why do you think that it seems to be just sort of unabated from the rest of the world? It just seems to continue, as you say.
So I think the first thing is that it's quite unfortunate because this is a daily reality of Palestinians in terms of restrictions to movement and denial of many other rights. But you're right, Israel continues to act the way it does because the international community allows it to. Israel continues to act with utter impunity because the international community, allows it to. And if you look at the anti-apartheid movement, during the struggle against our own apartheid flow and, the international solidarity movements that mobilized against South Africa because of its policy of apartheid and embarked on isolation campaigns, divestment campaigns, sanctions campaigns, academic boycotts, cultural boycotts, calling those in the creatives industry not to perform in South Africa or lend any kind of voice. And that's exactly what needs to be happening at a most intensified level internationally as well. If you look at what the ruling party in this country can be doing, the 54th ANC resolution to downgrade unconditionally and immediately the South African embassy in Israel, for example, it's a resolution that has not been implemented by the South African government. And if you look at the escalation of aggression from December flow, and you look at the Great Return March in May, and the killing of 100 Palestinians unarmed that were embarking on peaceful protest as well, the wounding of over 10,000 Palestinians as well. And you look at also the responses that came out in terms of the move by the the Trump administration moving their embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem as well, that also, were part of those demonstrations as well. This really called on for the South African government to put more pressure than what they did. I think the last conversation we had was when they pulled the South African ambassador from Israel. But definitely we need to be demanding more of our governments as a people, And, the ANC is not an exception. The ANC needs to be doing more. And I think because of the gift of international solidarity that we received, and we've seen what isolation campaigns can do, we need to also make Israel a pariah state that it is. If you continue to practice apartheid, we need to treat you like an apartheid state that you are. So really, it's about the international community, really allowing Israel to act with utter impunity. Governments of the world need to do more.
Let's go back to the Shashi Naidoo issue. Part of the reason they said they were denying her access is to what they perceive to them, to her seeking to harm their country. That's what Israel is saying. What do they mean by that? And I hate to sort of be facetious about the matter, but Shashi is a TV personality. She's a model. How much harm can she do to the country? What do they fear that she'll do, or what she'll perhaps find out in Palestine, and what can she even do with that information anyway?
I think the one thing is, I believe that had Shashi been granted passage into Palestine, the one thing is that she would have been, part of the people that have been to Palestine and that would tell you about the situation that's going on there, about, how the Israeli occupation of Palestine really affects, to the root, to the core of Palestinians in terms of the restrictions of movement, stripping them of their dignity. So she would have exposed the truth, we believe. And that's why I think Israel would then argue so silly, that she's a threat. And there is no basis, really. The way in which they continue to deny people, not just Shashi alone, an increasing number of South Africans in particular. And that's why diplomatic relations between the two countries really are just a farce. So the continued denial of many South Africans that embark on humanitarian efforts going into Palestine, are denied simply because they've spoken critical of the Israeli regime. So the problem is Shashi did not go on an Israeli lobby or Israeli regime-funded trip or sanctioned trip. And that's the main problem that they have with with. They didn't channel or maybe even, you know, shape the trip. That's the problem that they had.
Are you still in communication with Shashi? I mean, there have been ideas that perhaps she could be the face of BDS at some point. But a lot of people also being critical to BDS and saying that you, as an organization, are using this as some kind of a publicity stunt, you know, that, you know, she said something that was anti-Palestine, and then she had this apology that, you know, you had that joint press briefing together, and it just seemed like the greatest platform for you to push, you know, what you want to say about Israel. Is there any weight to that kind of argument?
I mean, it's not uncommon for, especially those within the creatives industry, that, for example, have come out under a lot of attack and hot water and been hot water in terms of how they, you know, the position on the question of Israel-Palestine. For example, Roger Waters from Pink Floyd. Back a couple of years ago, Roger Waters went and performed in Israel. And this was really followed by one of the major campaigns against Pink Floyd performing in Israel at the time, and really calling on artists really like him at the time to, you know, toe the picket line and support the ongoing cultural boycott against Israel. Today, Roger Waters is one of the biggest BDS supporters globally. He is actually in the forefront of the cultural boycott internationally. So it's not uncharacteristic to see, I think, people in general, you know, that hold one position, and then, you know, after a lot of engagements, a lot of learning, and a lot of interactions with the issue, but also people that have been there as well, that say, but you need to really rethink your position on the issue, that have come out and become, you know, great proponents of the Israeli-Palestine question and become pro-Palestinians themselves. So I just think that, you know, Shashi found herself in a position where she came around a lot of hot water. She was in the hot water, and she was really, people really came and found herself in a lot of backlash because of the things that she stated and so on. But you look at people like Black Coffee. On the one hand, I mean, he really went through, you know, the most on Twitter, and he still came out and said, it is what it is. And in essence, I am somebody that will continue to go to Israel, said something about money and family and so on, you know, and that he will not toe the picket line and continue to go to Israel. So those things are problematic. But I mean, 10 years from now, who knows? You could see Black Coffee being one of the biggest supporters of the BDS movement. We don't know, but we hope.